You know, there's places in the Appalachian Mountains that folks don't speak of, places long forgotten by the outside world, but etched into the memories of the locals like scars. One such place is Whistling Pines, a town so isolated that it barely exists on any map. The pines that surrounded it stand tall, their needles rustling in the wind like whispered secrets. The wind that blows through the town carries a sound, a high, keening whistle, like the moan of something ancient and restless. People knew better than to stray too close to the woods. Whispers of an old curse haunted the town, stories passed down through generations of mountain folks. Some said the forest was alive, that it watched and waited. Others spoke of a shadow, not a man or beast, but a darkness that moved with purpose. Most believed it was nothing more than folklore, a way to keep children from wandering too far into the wilderness. The truth was far more terrifying. It all started one cold autumn in 1926. The leaves had turned red and gold, blanketing the mountain in a fiery tapestry, and the air had taken on a crisp bite. Life was hard in Whistling Pines, but it had a steady rhythm until the disappearance began. Old Tom Bragg was the first to vanish. A recluse, he lived alone in a cabin on the outskirts of town, close to the forest's edge. He was a grizzled old man, known for his sour mood and sharp tongue, but harmless enough. When he failed to show up for supplies one week, no one paid much mind, but after 2 weeks the sheriff made his way up the mountain to check on him. When the sheriff arrived, Tom's door was wide open. His cabin was in perfect order, a fire burning low on the hearth, and a cup of coffee sat untouched on his table. Its contents was long cold. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, no tracks leading away from the cabin. The only thing unusual was a deep groove in the earth behind the cabin, as though something heavy had been dragged into the forest. There were no footprints, no animal tracks, just that strange, winding mark leading into the trees. The sheriff returned to town, but unsure what to make of it. Folks speculated that old Tom had gotten lost in the woods, maybe taken a bad fall. But those who knew the stories, the old-timers who still believed in the curses of the land, began to murmur about the shadow. A few of them swore they had seen something in the trees over the years, a dark figure moving just out of sight, watching. The fear began to spread, slowly at first, but it didn't take long for it to settle into the bones of the town. A week later, little Sally Miller disappeared. She was only 8 years old, full of life and mischief, the kind of child who always seemed to be in motion. She had gone to fetch water from the creek just before dark, something she had done hundreds of times before. But when her father went out to check on her, she was gone. He found her shawl tangled in the briars at the edge of the woods, but there was no other trace of her, no footprints, no signs of a struggle, just the same eerie silence that had surrounded old Tom's cabin. Panic set in. The town searched the woods, but they found nothing. The forest had swallowed Sally whole. The old-timers began to speak more openly of shadows, though they lowered their voice and glanced over their shoulders as they did so. They spoke of an ancient spirit, a curse laid down long before the town had been founded. They said the shadow was patient, that it had waited in the woods for centuries, biding its time, and that now it was awake again. Elias Granger, the town's blacksmith, didn't believe in curses or shadows. He was a practical man, with hands rough from years of hammering iron and a mind grounded in the physical world. But even Elias couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He had known Tom his whole life and had seen Sally grow up, and the idea that they had simply vanished didn't sit right with him. It was a stormy night, the wind howling through the pines, when Elias got a knock on his door. Standing on his porch was a man he didn't recognize, tall, gaunt, with eyes wide and wild. His clothing was torn, his face pale as death. "The shadow," the man rasped. "It's coming for us." Elias stepped back, startled by the man's sudden appearance and his words. He gestured for the man to come inside, but the stranger shook his head. "It won't stop. I've seen it. I've seen what it can do." The man's eyes darted toward the woods, his voice trembling. "It took them, Tom, Sally, and others. It's not done yet." Before Elias could ask more, a high-pitched whistle cut through the air. A sound carried on the wind, but twisted, unnatural. The stranger's face went white, and without another word, he turned and fled into the night. Elias stood on his porch, listened to the wind howl through the trees. The whistle grew louder, raising to a shriek that made his skin crawl. And then, just as quickly as it came, it stopped. He spent the rest of that night pacing his cabin, axe in hand, but nothing came. The morning dawned gray and silent, and Elias resolved to get to the bottom of what was happening in Whistling Pines. Over the next few days, more people disappeared. The town was gripped by fear, and soon people stopped leaving their homes altogether. Elias, however, was determined to find answers. He began to dig into the town's past, talking to old-timers who still remembered the stories of the shadow. It was one of the elders, a woman named Martha, who had lived in town since she was a child, who finally told him the truth. The shadow, she said, was no mere legend. It was a spirit of the land itself, angered by a betrayal long forgotten by most. When the first settlers came to this area, they had made a deal with the spirit that dwelled in the forest. In exchange for land and prosperity, the settlers had promised something in return, a sacrifice. But as the town grew and the settlers' descendants spread, they had forgotten the bargain. Now the spirit had come to collect. Martha handed Elias an old weathered journal. It had belonged to Jacob Miller, one of the town's founders. In it, Jacob wrote of the deal he and the other settlers had made. The spirit of the forest had agreed to grant them fertile land, rich resources, and protection from the harsh elements. But in return, the settlers had promised a tribute of blood, one soul every generation, to be offered to the shadow. For years, the town had kept its end of the bargain, but over time the memory of the deal had faded, and the town had grown complacent. The last offering had been made nearly a century ago. Now, the shadow had returned to collect its due, and it wouldn't stop until it had taken what it was owed. As Elias read the journal, the pieces began to fall into place. The disappearance, the strange sounds in the woods. It was all connected to the broken bargain. He knew that the only way to stop the shadow was to fulfill the deal. But before he could act, the stranger returned. This time he didn't knock. He burst through Elias's door, his face wild with panic. "It's too late," the stranger gasped. "It's coming for all of us." Elias demanded to know who the man was, and the stranger revealed that he was a descendant of one of the original settlers, a family tasked with making the sacrifice. His ancestors had fled the town, abandoned their duty, and the shadow had been hunting them ever since. I thought I could outrun it, the stranger said, his voice shaking, but it found me. It always finds you. The stranger's voice sent a chill down Elias' spine. If the shadow was tied to the descendants of the original settlers, then it wasn't just the town that was in danger. It was the people, the bloodline. The town gathered at the church, seeking refuge as the storm outside grew more violent. The wind howled and the pines outside whistled like a chorus of wailing voices. The townspeople huddled together, desperate and terrified, as Elias explained what he had learned. "We have to make the sacrifice," he said grimly. "It's the only way." The townfolk stared at him in horror. No one wanted to believe it, but deep down they all knew the truth. The shadow wasn't going to stop. It would take all of them if they didn't fulfill the bargain. As the storm raged outside, the door of the church blew open. A cold wind swept through the room, extinguishing the candles and plunging the room into darkness. And then they heard it, the whistle, rising and falling like a haunting melody. The shadow was here. It moved through the room like a living darkness. It was shifting and twisting in the flickering light. One by one, the townspeople vanished, swallowed by the blackness. Their screams echoed through the night, but no one could stop it. Elias stood alone, the journal in one hand and his axe in the other. He knew what had to be done. He stepped forward, offering himself to the shadow, knowing that it was the only way to save the town. But as the darkness closed in around him, Elias felt a sudden clarity. The shadow wasn't just a force of nature. It was a reflection of the town's guilt, its forgotten sins. It fed on fear, on secrets, on the darkness of men's hearts. Elias dropped the axe and closed his eyes. He let go of his fear, of the anger that had built up inside him for years. And as he did, the shadow seemed to hesitate. For a moment, the whistling stopped. The darkness paused, as if uncertain. And then slowly it began to retreat, fading back into the woods. The morning sun broke through the clouds, casting golden light over the devastated town. The storm had passed, and the shadow was gone for now. Elias was the only one left, standing alone in the ruins of Whistling Pines. The town people had been taken, their fates unknown, but Elias had survived. He knew that the shadow would return one day, that the bargain could never truly be broken. But for now, the forest was silent and the wind carried no whistle. The shadow of Whistling Pines remains a mystery, a lingering fear in the hearts of those who had heard the stories. And though Elias lived with the knowledge of what had happened, he knew that the land, like the shadow, never truly forgot.